Maria Santos had been invisible for 23 years. Not literally, of course, but in the way that people who clean up after others often become background figures moving quietly through spaces that belong to someone else. At 45, her hands told the story of decades spent scrubbing, polishing, and maintaining the pristine world of the ultra-wealthy. Every morning at 5:30, she would take 2 buses and a subway train to reach the towering glass building that housed the penthouse of billionaire tech mogul David Chin. The routine never changed. Security would nod her through after scanning her badge. The private elevator would carry her silently to the 42nd floor. She would enter through the service entrance, slip on her soft-soled shoes, and begin the careful choreography of maintaining a 20,000 square foot apartment that cost more than most people would earn in several lifetimes. David Chin was rarely there when she worked. He traveled constantly for business, attended board meetings, or locked himself away in his home office during video conferences that connected him to every corner of the globe. When their paths did cross, the interaction was minimal, a polite nod, perhaps a quiet, good morning, if he was feeling particularly social. Maria preferred it that way. She had learned long ago that the wealthy valued their privacy above almost everything else, and her job security depended on being efficient, thorough, and above all unnoticed. But today felt different. Maria could sense it the moment she stepped off the elevator. The apartment, usually empty and echoing with the hum of expensive appliances, buzzed with an energy that made her stomach clench with anxiety. She heard voices coming from the main living area, David's familiar baritone mixed with at least 3 others she didn't recognize. She glanced at her watch. 7:15 in the morning was unusually early for business meetings, especially ones conducted in the residential area rather than his office. She moved carefully toward the kitchen, planning to start there and work her way through the apartment once the meeting concluded. The voices grew clearer as she approached, and despite her best efforts to tune them out, fragments of conversation drifted toward her. The quarterly projections are exceeding expectations by 30%, someone was saying. The AI division alone generated more revenue last month than our closest competitor managed all year. What about the Southeast Asian expansion? David's voice carried the calm confidence that had made him one of the most feared negotiators in Silicon Valley. Ahead of schedule. We'll have operations in 6 new markets by year-end. The local partnerships are proving more valuable than we initially projected. Maria began unpacking her cleaning supplies in the kitchen, trying to focus on her work rather than the conversation happening 20 feet away. She had heard similar discussions hundreds of times over the years. Talk of millions and billions, market dominance, strategic acquisitions. The numbers were so large they had become abstract, like hearing someone discuss the distance between stars. She filled her bucket with warm water and began wiping down the marble countertops that probably cost more than her annual salary. The kitchen was already spotless. It always was, since David rarely cooked for himself, but maintaining the illusion of perfection was part of her job. As she worked, her mind wandered to the phone call she had received the night before. "Mama, the doctors say we need to make a decision soon." Her daughter Carmen's voice had been tight with stress and exhaustion. "The treatment is available, but insurance won't cover the experimental therapy. They're calling it investigational, not medically necessary." Maria had sat in her small apartment in Queens, staring at the stack of medical bills that covered her kitchen table like accusations. Her mother, Elena, had raised 5 children as a single parent after Maria's father died in a construction accident. Elena had worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table and had never once complained. Now, at 78, she was fighting pancreatic cancer, and the conventional treatments weren't working. "How much?" Maria had asked, though she already suspected the answer would be devastating. 200,000. Maybe more, depending on how long the treatment takes and if there are complications. Maria had closed her eyes and tried to imagine where such money could possibly come from. Her savings account held exactly $4,700. Money she had been setting aside for years with the dream of eventually buying a small house somewhere her mother could live comfortably. Her credit was decent but not good enough for a loan that size, even if she could figure out how to make the payments on her $38,000 annual salary. Now, as she cleaned a kitchen that cost more than most homes, the impossibility of her situation felt crushing. Around the corner, men were casually discussing amounts of money that could save her mother's life the way she might talk about buying groceries. The irony wasn't lost on her, but it felt more like a cruel joke than an opportunity. "Maria?" David's voice cut through her thoughts, and she nearly dropped the cloth she was holding. She turned to find him standing in the kitchen entrance, his expression unreadable. Behind him, she could see 3 men in expensive suits gathering papers and closing laptops. "Yes, sir?" she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "The meeting is wrapping up. Will you need about an hour to finish the main areas?" "Of course, Mr. Chin. I'll start in the guest wing and work my way back." He nodded and turned to leave, then paused. "Is everything all right? You seem—" He hesitated, searching for the right word. "Distracted." The question caught her completely off guard. In all the years of minimal interaction, he had never asked about her well-being or noticed her mood. For a moment, she considered telling him the truth. The words formed in her mind: "My mother is dying, and I can't afford to save her." But the thought disappeared as quickly as it had come. David Chin was her employer, not her friend, and sharing personal problems with billionaires was not part of her job description. "I'm fine, sir. Just a little tired." He studied her face for a moment longer, and she had the unsettling feeling that he could see right through her polite deflection. But instead of pressing the issue, he simply nodded. "Take your time with the cleaning today. I'll be in my office for the next few hours." As he walked away, Maria realized her hands were shaking. She gripped the edge of the marble counter and tried to steady herself. She couldn't afford to fall apart at work. She couldn't afford to lose this job. She couldn't afford anything, really, except to keep moving forward and hope that somehow, someway, a solution would present itself. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of routine tasks. She vacuumed the Persian rugs that cost more than her car, dusted the artwork that could have funded a small hospital, and polished the windows that offered a view of a city where her mother was lying in a hospital bed, running out of time. When she finished the guest wing, she moved to the main living area where the meeting had taken place. The men had left behind the subtle evidence of their presence: slightly displaced cushions, water rings on the coffee table, the faint scent of expensive cologne. As she straightened the space, she noticed a folder that had been left behind on the side table. She picked it up, intending to set it aside where David would be sure to find it. The folder fell open in her hands, revealing pages of financial documents. She tried not to look, but her eyes caught on a series of numbers that made her breath catch. It was a summary of David's charitable giving for the tax year, donations to various foundations and causes that totaled more than $50 million. Maria stared at the page, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. $50 million. Given away in a single year. More money than she could comprehend, distributed to organizations she had never heard of, causes that probably helped thousands of people she would never meet. She closed the folder quickly and set it carefully on David's desk, but the image of those numbers stayed with her as she finished her work. By the time she had completed her rounds and was packing up her supplies, an idea had begun to form in her mind. It was a terrible idea, probably a career-ending idea, but it was the only one she had. As she prepared to leave, she realized David's office door was open and he was visible at his desk, focused on his computer screen. She had never initiated a conversation with him beyond the basic pleasantries their work required. She had never asked him for anything. She had never stepped outside the invisible boundaries that defined their relationship. But her mother was dying. Maria stood in the hallway for several long minutes, cleaning supplies in hand, trying to work up the courage to do something that terrified her more than anything she had ever contemplated. She thought about Elena, who had sacrificed everything for her children. She thought about Carmen, who was struggling to balance her own family's needs with caring for her grandmother. She thought about the $200,000 that stood between her mother and a chance at more time. And she thought about the man in the office who had just given away $50 million to strangers. Taking a deep breath that felt like it might be her last as David Chen's employee, Maria knocked softly on the office door frame. David looked up from his computer screen, his expression shifting from concentration to mild surprise. In all the years Maria had worked for him, she had never knocked on his office door. Their interactions were limited to brief exchanges in passing, and she had never sought him out for conversation. "Yes, Maria? Did you forget something?" She stood in the doorway, still holding her cleaning supplies, her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. The office was a monument to success, walls lined with awards, photographs with world leaders, and windows that offered a commanding view of Manhattan. She felt smaller than ever in this space that represented everything she would never have. "Mr. Chen, She started, then stopped. The words she had rehearsed in the hallway suddenly seemed impossible to speak aloud. He set down his pen and gave her his full attention, which somehow made everything worse. David Chin was accustomed to making decisions worth millions of dollars without hesitation, to commanding rooms full of powerful people, to having conversations that shaped entire industries. What could she possibly say that would matter to someone like that? "Is everything all right?" he asked, and there was something in his tone that reminded her he had asked the same question earlier. This time, she couldn't hide behind a polite deflection. "No, sir. Everything is not all right." The words came out more forcefully than she had intended, and she saw his eyebrows raise slightly. "I'm sorry. I don't mean to bother you with personal matters." "I know that's not appropriate. But—" He leaned back in his chair, and she realized he was waiting for her to continue rather than dismissing her outright.
This can't wait.
Maria took a step into the office, then stopped. She had crossed a line by entering his personal workspace uninvited, but there was no turning back now. "My mother is dying, Mr. Chen. Pancreatic cancer. The doctors say there's an experimental treatment that might help, but it's not covered by insurance. The cost is—" She paused, the number still difficult to speak aloud. $200,000. He listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. She couldn't tell if he was sympathetic, annoyed, or simply waiting for her to finish so he could return to his work. "I know this is completely inappropriate," she continued, her voice gaining strength as she went on. "I know I'm just the person who cleans your home, and you don't owe me anything beyond my paycheck. But I've worked for you for years, and I've never asked for anything. I've never been late, never missed a day, never broken anything or betrayed your privacy." David nodded slowly. "That's all true. You've been exemplary. I saw the folder," she said, then immediately regretted the admission. "I didn't mean to look, but it fell open when I picked it up. I saw how much you donate to charity each year." His expression hardened slightly, and she realized she was approaching dangerous territory. Commenting on his private financial information was definitely crossing a line, but she had already committed to this course of action. "I'm not asking for charity," she said quickly. "I'm asking for a loan. I know I can't qualify for something that large through a bank, and I know my salary isn't enough to make payments on a normal schedule. But I could work extra hours, take on additional responsibilities. I could clean your other properties, work weekends, whatever you need." She was speaking faster now, desperate to get all the words out before he stopped her. "I could sign a contract making me responsible for the money even if something happens to my job. I could put my apartment up as collateral, though I know it's not worth much. I just need a chance to save my mother." When she finished, the office fell silent except for the distant hum of traffic 42 floors below. David steepled his fingers in front of his face and studied her with an intensity that made her want to disappear. "How long have you worked for me, Maria?" 23 years, sir. And in all that time, you've never asked for a raise, a bonus, time off for emergencies, or any special consideration." "No, sir. I was grateful to have the job. Why now? Why risk your employment by making this request?" The question hit her like a physical blow because it forced her to confront the reality she had been trying to avoid. Because she's going to die if I don't try everything. Because I'd rather lose my job trying to save her than keep it and watch her slip away. Because some things are more important than being invisible." That last sentence hung in the air between them, and she realized she had just articulated something she hadn't fully understood until that moment. For 23 years, she had made herself small and unnoticeable because she thought that was what the job required. But her mother's life was bigger than any job, bigger than any fear of consequences. David was quiet for a long moment, and she could see him processing what she had said. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than before. "Tell me about your mother." The request surprised her. She had prepared for him to say yes or no, to offer practical solutions or polite rejections. She hadn't expected him to want to know about Elena. "Her name is Elena Santos," Maria began hesitantly. "She raised 5 children on her own after my father died in a construction accident. She worked as a seamstress during the day and cleaned offices at night. She never finished high school because she had to start working to help support her own family when she was 14. As she spoke, Maria found herself relaxing slightly. Talking about her mother felt like safer ground than discussing money. "She taught all of us to work hard and be honest. She used to say that dignity wasn't about how much money you had, but about how you treated people and whether you kept your word. When I was 17 and pregnant with my daughter, she didn't lecture me or make me feel ashamed. She just helped me figure out how to finish school and find work." David listened intently, occasionally nodding. "What does she think about this treatment?" "She doesn't know I'm here," Maria admitted. "She would be horrified that I asked you for money. She's always been proud, never wanted to be a burden to anyone. She keeps saying the doctors have done enough, that she's lived a good life and we shouldn't waste money on someone her age. But you disagree. She's only 78, Mr. Chin. Her mind is sharp, her spirit is strong. The only thing failing is her body, and the doctors think this treatment could give her months, maybe years. She could see my grandson graduate from high school. She could teach my daughter more of her recipes. She could have time to write down all the family stories she carries in her head." Maria realized she was crying and wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I'm sorry. I know this isn't professional. Don't apologize." David stood up from his desk and walked to the window, his hands clasped behind his back. "Maria, can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. What do you think of me?" The question was so unexpected that she almost laughed. "Sir? You've worked in my home for over 2 decades. You've seen how I live, overheard my business conversations, observed my habits. What's your honest opinion of the kind of person I am?" Maria felt like she was walking through a minefield. How could she possibly answer such a question honestly without risking everything? "I think you're very successful," she said carefully. "That's not what I asked?" She took a deep breath. If she was already risking her job, she might as well be truthful. "I think you're brilliant at business and you work incredibly hard. I think you're private and you don't trust easily. I think you care about things, but you don't let people see what those things are. I think you're probably lonely, even though you have more money and power than most people could dream of." He turned from the window to look at her. "And what makes you think I'm lonely?" "Because in 23 years, I've never seen you truly relaxed. I've never heard you laugh. I've never seen evidence that you have friends who come by just to spend time with you, not to discuss business. Your family photos are all formal portraits, not candid moments. Your home is beautiful, but it doesn't feel lived in, it feels like a museum." She stopped abruptly, realizing she had said far too much. "I'm sorry, Mr. Chin. I shouldn't have. No, you're right." He returned to his desk but didn't sit down. "I've spent so many years focused on building the business, on achieving the next milestone, that I've lost touch with almost everything else. I can't remember the last time I had a conversation that wasn't about work or money." He looked directly at her. "Including this one." Maria felt her heart sink. Of course this was about money. She had been foolish to think that sharing her story might make any difference to someone whose life operated on a completely different scale from hers. But that's going to change, he said, and she looked up in confusion. I don't understand. David sat back down and opened his laptop. I'm going to help your mother, Maria. Not as a loan, as a gift. I'm going to cover all her medical expenses, whatever the treatment costs. Maria felt the floor shift beneath her feet. Mr. Chin, I can't accept charity. I told you I was asking for a loan. And I'm telling you that sometimes accepting help isn't about charity, it's about allowing someone else the opportunity to do something meaningful with their resources. He typed something on his laptop, then looked back at her. Do you know how much money I gave away last year? She thought about the folders she had seen. $50 million. Closer to 60, actually. Do you know how much difference any of it made in my daily life? She shook her head. None. Not a single donation changed anything about how I live, what I eat, where I travel, or what I can afford to buy. The money just moved from one account to another, from my wealth manager to various organizations' development offices. It was tax efficient and strategically sound, but it was completely abstract. He paused, studying her face. But this is different. This is concrete. This is a woman who raised 5 children and worked 3 jobs and deserves a chance to see her grandsons grow up. This is her daughter who has served my family loyally for decades and has never asked for anything in return. This is the first time in years that I can help someone where I can actually see the impact of that help. Maria found herself unable to speak. The relief, gratitude, and disbelief were overwhelming, but underneath those emotions was something else she couldn't quite identify. There is one condition, David continued, and her stomach clenched with anxiety again. What condition? He smiled, and she realized it was the first time she had ever seen him look genuinely happy. I want to meet her. I want to hear her stories about raising 5 children and working 3 jobs. I want to know what kind of person inspires this level of devotion from their daughter. Maria stared at him, trying to process what was happening. You want to meet my mother? If she's willing. And if you're comfortable with that. The request seemed surreal, but as she thought about it, she realized it also seemed right. Elena had always taught her children that kindness should be acknowledged and thanked, that accepting help gracefully was as important as offering it. She would like that, Maria said finally. She would want to thank you herself. Good. Then, we have a deal. He extended his hand to her, and after a moment's hesitation, she shook it. As their hands met, Maria realized that in the space of a single conversation, everything had changed. Not just her mother's medical prospects, but her entire relationship with the man she had worked for in silence for over 2 decades. For the first time, she had been seen not as the invisible woman who cleaned his home, but as a person with a story worth hearing and a problem worth solving. But she also sensed that David Shin had been changed by the conversation too, though she couldn't yet understand how or why. 3 days later, Maria stood in the hospital corridor outside her mother's room, nervously smoothing her best dress and checking her watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. David Shin was due to arrive at any moment, and she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to witness something unprecedented, a collision between 2 worlds that had no business intersecting. Inside the room, Elena Santos sat propped up against a stack of pillows, wearing the new nightgown Carmen had bought for the occasion. At 78, even weakened by months of treatment, she maintained the regal bearing that had commanded respect throughout Maria's childhood. Her silver hair was carefully braided, and her dark eyes held the sharp intelligence that had helped her navigate decades of challenges as a single mother. Mija, you look nervous, Elena said in Spanish as Maria entered the room. It's just a man. A wealthy man, yes, but still just a man who puts his pants on one leg at a time. Maria managed a smile despite her anxiety. Mama, this man could buy and sell entire countries. I'm not sure normal rules apply to him. The most important rules always apply, no matter how much money someone has. Elena replied firmly. Respect, gratitude, honesty. These things don't change based on bank accounts. Carmen arrived just as visiting hours began, carrying flowers and wearing the worried expression that had become her default since Elena's diagnosis. Has he arrived yet? I still can't believe this is happening. A billionaire coming to visit Abuela in Queens General Hospital. It sounds like something from a telenovela. It sounds like something from my life, which has apparently become a telenovela. Maria muttered, peering out the window at the parking lot below. At exactly 2 o'clock, a black sedan pulled up to the hospital entrance. Maria watched as David emerged from the passenger seat, declining his driver's offer to accompany him inside. He was dressed more casually than she had ever seen him, khakis and a button-down shirt instead of his usual suit, but he still looked distinctly out of place in the gritty urban landscape of Queens. He's here, she announced, her voice tight with nervousness. Elena adjusted her blankets and folded her hands in her lap. Good. I have things to say to this man. 5 minutes later, there was a soft knock on the door. Maria opened it to find David standing in the hallway, holding a small bouquet of white roses. He looked as nervous as she felt, which she found oddly comforting. Mr. Chin, she said formally, then realized how ridiculous formality seemed in this setting. David. Thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. These are for your mother. He handed her the flowers, and she noticed his hands weren't entirely steady. Mama, this is David Chin, Maria said in English as they entered the room. David, my mother, Elena Santos. Elena studied David with the unblinking directness that had intimidated Maria's teenage boyfriends and college professors alike. For a moment, the room was silent except for the steady beep of monitoring equipment. Sit down, young man, Elena said finally, her English heavily accented but clear. You look like you're about to run away. David's tension broke into a surprised laugh, the first genuine laugh Maria had heard from him. I feel like I might, he admitted, taking the chair beside Elena's bed. I'm not sure what the proper protocol is for this situation. Protocol is simple, Elena said. You listen, I talk. You ask questions if you have them. We figure out if we like each other or if we're just being polite because you're paying for my medical bills. Carmen nearly choked on her coffee, and Maria shot her mother a warning look. But David seemed delighted by Elena's directness. I'd prefer honesty to politeness, he said. I get enough politeness in my regular life. Good. Then I tell you right away that I don't like taking your money. Maria says it's not charity, but it feels like charity to me. I worked my whole life, raised 5 children, never took handouts from anyone. Now I'm too old and too sick to pay my own way, and that sits badly with me. David leaned forward in his chair. Mrs. Santos, may I ask you something? Elena. And yes. If one of your children was in trouble and needed help, would you consider it charity to help them? Of course not. They're my children. That's different. Is it? Because from where I sit, Maria has been part of my daily life for 23 years. She's taken care of my home, anticipated my needs, maintained my privacy, and never asked for anything in return. That kind of loyalty and dedication, doesn't that create a kind of family bond? Elena was quiet for a moment, considering his words. You think of Maria as family? I think I should have thought of Maria as family a long time ago. I think I've been so focused on business relationships and professional boundaries that I forgot relationships can be more than that, even when they start in a professional context. Elena's expression suggested she was reassessing her initial impression of this man. Maria tells me you want to hear my stories. Why? You could meet much more important people than an old woman in a hospital bed. David was quiet for a moment, and Maria could see him choosing his words carefully. Elena, can I tell you about my mother? I would like that. Her name was Lin Chin. She came to America from Taiwan when she was 19, speaking almost no English, with $47 and a suitcase of homemade clothes. She worked in a garment factory during the day and took English classes at night. When she met my father, he was a graduate student in engineering, nearly broke, studying by streetlight because he couldn't afford to keep the electricity on in his apartment. Elena nodded approvingly. Hard workers. The hardest. They built everything from nothing: the language skills, the education, the business contacts, the financial stability. My father eventually started a small electronics company, and my mother kept the books while raising me and my sister. They never had much money when I was growing up, but they had stories. Stories about the courage it took to leave everything familiar behind, about the dignity of hard work, about the importance of family. His voice grew softer. They both died in a car accident when I was 25, just as the business was starting to succeed. I inherited the company, but I also inherited something else: this drive to prove that their sacrifices meant something, that their hard work wasn't wasted on an ungrateful son. You built the company into something bigger, Elena said. It wasn't a question. Much bigger. But somewhere in the process, I lost touch with the stories. I stopped thinking about where I came from and focused only on where I was going. I surrounded myself with people who only cared about what I had accomplished, not how I had gotten there or who had helped me along the way. David looked directly at Elena. When Maria told me about your life, raising 5 children alone, working 3 jobs, teaching your family about dignity and hard work, it reminded me of my parents' stories. Stories about real people making real sacrifices for the people they love. I realized I've been so insulated by wealth that I've forgotten what those stories sound like. Elena was quiet for several long minutes. When she finally spoke, her voice was gentler than before. Your parents would be proud of what you built, but maybe not so proud of how lonely it made you. I think you're right. Good. Then, we understand each other. Elena shifted in her bed, wincing slightly but maintaining her composed expression. Now I tell you some things about Maria that maybe she never told you herself. Maria felt her cheeks burn. Mama, no embarrassing stories. Not embarrassing. Important. Elena looked at David. When Maria was 17 and pregnant, everyone said she should drop out of school. Even some family members said she had made her choice and had to live with consequences. But Maria was determined to graduate, to go to college, to build a better life for herself and her baby. I didn't know Maria had a daughter, David said, glancing at Maria with surprise. Carmen, Elena continued, gesturing toward the corner where Carmen sat listening with tears in her eyes. Maria worked cleaning offices at night, while she finished high school during the day. After Carmen was born, she took classes at community college while I watched the baby. She wanted to become a teacher. What happened? David asked. Maria looked uncomfortable. Life happened. Carmen got sick when she was 2, pneumonia that turned into complications. Medical bills, lost time from work, falling behind in classes. By the time everything stabilized, I was too far behind to catch up with my college plans. The cleaning job you gave me was the best opportunity one could find. But she never stopped learning, Elena said proudly. She reads everything: newspapers, magazines, books from the library. She helps Carmen with college homework. She probably knows more about business than half the people who work in those fancy offices, just from listening and paying attention all these years. David looked thoughtful. Is that true? Maria shifted uncomfortably. I don't know about that. But I do listen. It's hard not to learn things when you're around people making important decisions. What have you learned? The question was clearly meant to be taken seriously, not as polite conversation. Maria thought for a moment before answering. I've learned that most business problems aren't really about money or technology. They're about people not communicating clearly, or not trusting each other, or not understanding what the other person actually needs. I've watched you have meetings where everyone agreed on a solution, but I could tell they were all thinking about different problems. David raised his eyebrows. Can you give me an example? Last month, you had that conference call about the European expansion. Everyone kept talking about market penetration and competitive positioning, but it seemed like the real issue was that your European partners felt like they weren't being consulted about decisions that affected their regions. They weren't arguing about strategy, they were arguing about respect. You picked up on that from cleaning the room? I picked up on that from listening to the tone of voices and watching body language. When people feel excluded, they act defensive, even when they're discussing things they actually agree about. Elena beamed with pride. See? I told you she pays attention. David was staring at Maria with an expression she couldn't quite read. Would you be interested in paying attention more officially? I don't understand. I'm saying I might have been underutilizing your skills for the past 23 years. I'm saying maybe there's a role in my organization for someone who notices things other people miss, someone who understands the human side of business decisions. Maria felt like the conversation was moving too fast. David, I appreciate the offer, but I'm a housekeeper. I don't have a college degree or business training. You have 23 years of observing how successful people operate. You have instincts about human behavior that business schools don't teach. And you have something else that's much rarer in my world. What's that? Courage. The courage to speak honestly when something important is at stake. The courage to risk everything for the people you care about. Elena reached over and took David's hand. This is why I like you, young man. You see what matters. As Maria watched her mother and her former employer, holding hands beside a hospital bed in Queens, she realized that everything in her life was changing so fast she could barely keep up. 3 days ago, she had been invisible. Now she was being offered opportunities she had never dreamed of by a man who had never really seen her before. But the biggest change wasn't in her circumstances. Sometimes the most powerful words come from the most unexpected places. What happens when desperation meets opportunity, and a simple request changes everything? This is the true story of Maria Santos, a hard-working maid whose bold ask to one of the world's wealthiest men revealed something neither of them saw coming. Her words didn't just save a life, they transformed 2 worlds that should never have met. In a society where money talks and silence is expected from those who serve, Maria was about to break every unwritten rule. What she said next would challenge everything her billionaire employer thought he knew about courage, family, and what really matters in life.